Inflation, inflation, inflation. I'm sure you must have seen this word everywhere on the internet, and your friends and families are probably screaming about things getting more expensive left and right. I know, I can totally feel you. But instead of just looking at inflation as rising prices of everything, I'm gonna discuss about inflation in more depth so that you have a better understanding of it, what's causing it, how it affects you, and what you can do so that you won't just be a sitting duck when an economic crisis happens. And the best thing is, if you watch this video until the end, I will turn you from a noob into a pro so that you can impress your lunch buddies when they start talking about inflation. You're welcome. Sounds good? Let's start with the definition of inflation. According to Investopedia, inflation is a rise in prices, which can also be translated as the decline of purchasing power over time. There's two parts to this sentence. Inflation is a rise in prices. For example, a cup of coffee today is gonna cost more than a cup of coffee 10 or 20 years ago. That's because the economies of countries grow over time. Your salary, it grows over time. Your employer's company, it grows over time. The number of cars on the road, it grows over time. The number of new houses being built, it grows over time. That's because the number of population in the world grows over time, and when there's more people, that means there will be more demand for goods and services like food, oil, cars, houses, etc. And when there's demand, there will be supply. Pretty obvious, right? But of course, this supply and demand, it will never be in equilibrium, and we will either have more demand at some point in time or have more supply. That's just how the world works. It will never be fair. Just like how some people can be born with a silver spoon while I'm here making YouTube videos on a fine Saturday afternoon. What am I doing with my life? But anyways, Economics 101. Remember these two sentences. When demand decreases but supply remains the same, then prices will fall because there's less people wanting the same thing, right? That's deflation. Vice versa, when demand increases but supply remains the same, then prices will increase because there are now more people wanting the same thing. This is inflation, where you see things get more expensive. And remember the sentence from Investopedia earlier, that's precisely the second part of it, where you have a decline in purchasing power because your $1 now can purchase less stuff today compared to say 20 years ago. I still remember back in the days, my 1 ringgit was enough to buy me a huge bowl of noodle for lunch, plus some leftover to buy some coolest looking eraser. But today, that same 1 ringgit can barely buy a bottle of water from 7-Eleven. Pretty sad if you ask me. Anyways, I digress. Let's first talk about how inflation is measured, because we can't just measure it based on the price of your coffee or your KFC lunch set or your home prices. That's just not a fair way to look at it, right? Well, one of the most well-known indicators to measure inflation is the Consumer Price Index, CPI, and as its name goes, it measures the percentage change in the price of a basket of goods and services consumed by people like me and you, and it goes by this formula: the CPI today minus the CPI 1 year ago, and you divided it by the CPI 1 year ago to get the percentage change. Pretty simple, right? And when I mention price of a basket of goods and services, that may vary slightly from country to country because different countries define their products differently. But very broadly, using Malaysia's CPI as an example, they look at items like food and beverages, clothing and footwear, housing and utility bill, furniture costs, healthcare costs, transport costs, and etc. You get the drill. Basically, everything that a consumer needs is being taken into consideration, and they are formed into this index number that we call it CPI. So the fact that you can see CPI for Malaysia is 4.4% in July 2022, that means prices of everything in July 2022 is on average 4.4% more expensive compared to July 2021. And that is what we typically call it the headline CPI that you can see all across the news, because it covers everything under the roof. And then we have core inflation, where they exclude food and energy components from the CPI calculation, because those two are deemed to be more volatile and may not necessarily reflect the actual inflation that is happening in the country. Economists actually prefer this over the headline CPI but for all intended purposes, you can just look at the headline CPI. And for your information, economists all across the world actually recommend 2% of inflation in prices every year to be considered a healthy number for any given economy. And even the Federal Reserve of the US have been targeting inflation to be around 2% per year since 1996. But today, as of the month of August 2022, the inflation in the United States of America grew 8.3% year over year. That is about 3 times more than the preferred 2%. So the bigger question here is, why? What's causing all of this inflation? And before I answer that, the reason why I quoted the United States is because the US dollar is the world reserve currency, which means most of the bonds, commodities like gold and oil, everything is traded using the US dollar. Your country needs petrol? Pay in US dollar. Your country needs raw food materials? Pay in US dollar. You get my point. And plus, they house the largest stock exchanges in the form of New York Stock Exchange and the Nasdaq Stock Exchange, which means most of the capital flow all over the world will be concentrated in this country. That means whatever happens in the US market will have ripple effect towards the global economy, and none of the countries are spared from it. You see, 2 years ago when the COVID-19 pandemic started, we had massive lockdowns, which meant businesses were forced to shut down or go bankrupt. That caused the global economy to stand still, and even the US is not spared from it as well. So to avoid an economic recession, the US Federal Reserve had to intervene by printing money through reducing interest rates and injecting it into the economy to stimulate more spendings and help businesses. But of course, doing that means there are now more money supply in the economy, and the US M2 money supply surged to an all-time high. And when that happened, everyone got richer. People start buying stuff they don't need left and right. They started spending recklessly, and of course the economy got stimulated, and the S&P 500 index grew almost 60% during the pandemic in 2020. And just imagine, everyone left and right getting 60% richer while businesses are shut down and people start losing jobs. It's crazy, right? Well, of course, that party didn't last long. Remember what I said earlier, Economics 101. When there's too much demand for stuff left and right, but supply remains the same. And the supply was actually made worse due to the supply chain issues, which is a whole other topic that I'm not gonna go into today. Prices will increase, right? That is what resulted in the sky-high inflation that we have today. It's a combination of skyrocketing demand when supply chain was an issue, and it was made worse when the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, which introduced an entirely new energy crisis to the European region. And as a result, it sent another shockwave towards the global economy. And for the less fortunate countries that are already facing issues internally, that is literally a double whammy, because hyperinflation is literally eating up their country. If you're enjoying this video up to this point, consider subscribing, and I promise to make more and better quality videos for you. Alright, let's get back to business. So back to the US, the Federal Reserve cannot let inflation just run rampantly and do nothing about it, because they have this thing called the dual mandate, and that is to maintain price stability, aka keep inflation close to 2%, and also to achieve maximum employment for the US economy. So in order to drive inflation back to the 2% level from the current 8.3%, they had to intervene once again by doing the exact opposite of printing money, and that is increasing the interest rates. And when that happens, your car loan and mortgage, it gets more expensive. Businesses have to pay more interest on their debt, and as a result, everyone starts to get poorer, and subsequently demand will start to fall, and that will have pressure towards inflation, because when demand fall while supply remain the same, prices will fall, right? But of course, it's not as simple as that, because when the US increases their interest rates, it doesn't just affect the US economy, because like I've said earlier, it affects the global economy. Firstly, the non-US dollar currency will depreciate against the US dollar. See, when the US increase the interest rates, the US dollar becomes more expensive. That means the US dollar becomes more valuable in relative to many other non-US dollar currencies. And as a result, more foreign investors start piling into the US market in the form of bonds and securities. And the cycle keeps happening until today, and that is why you can see all the other currencies depreciate against the US dollar. The British pound sterling, it's down almost 20% year over year. Euro down 70%, Japanese yen down over 22%, Chinese renminbi down 10%, Sing dollar down 5.5%, and my beloved currency feels bad, man. Next, when global inflation runs rampant, everything gets more expensive. That means the money that you have right now will lose its purchasing power, PP. Your groceries and food, utility bills, transportation costs, subscription services, everything, you name it, they all will have some form of price hike, and if not, I bet there will be some reduction in quantity or quality by the sellers in order to compensate for the hike in prices. And that is why employees all across the world are fighting for an increase in wage or their salary, because they are trying to keep up with inflation, which has impacted their daily lives. And thirdly, when inflation goes out of hand like what we have right now, central banks all across the world will also follow suit to start hiking their interest rates. And when that happens, all debts and loans, like I've mentioned, will get more expensive to be paid. Very quickly, using this home loan calculator, for a 1 million ringgit property, a 3% interest rate means you need to pay about 3,463 ringgit of monthly repayment. But if you increase it by just 1%, a 4% interest rate means you need to pay about 3,984 ringgit per month. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a 13% increase in your monthly debt obligation when the central banks increase the interest rates by just 1%. And for your information, the United States aim to raise a total of 4.4% of interest rate in 2022 alone. And if that number doesn't sound an alarm to you, you better start looking at all your floating rate loans and mortgages, because trust me, it will come at you very, very soon. And the last thing you need to know here is when central banks increase interest rates, it doesn't just affect individuals like me and you, because businesses also will feel the pinch, as most of the businesses have debts on their balance sheet. A mere 1% increase in a company's interest payment could easily mean 4 to 5% lesser profit margin on their P&L. And that is a huge pain to take for sure. So watch out, because companies may choose to lay off workers in order to keep their company afloat, or just being defensive for the time being, like what happened during the pandemic, or even now as we speak, where people got laid off left and right. Just know that at the back of your head, in case an economic crisis hits on top of the high interest rates, your job could be at jeopardy. So remember to size up your emergency fund appropriately, or just avoid bad debt as much as possible. Okay, if you are still watching this video at this point, pat yourself at the back, because consider yourself well educated with the ins and outs of inflation and what's happening in the global economy right now. Because yes, prices are rising everywhere, but you got to look at the broader picture to fully understand the short, medium and long-term impact of it. And the more you understand about it, the better you can position yourself financially and not get slaughtered like a pig when recession hits. If you're looking for capital preservation, cash is not a bad idea at all, because you can deploy it in the face of a crisis or just buy assets at a discount. But if you want to stay slightly behind inflation, perhaps fixed deposits or money market funds could be part of your asset allocation strategy. However, if you prefer growth and want to stay on top of inflation, you should ideally look at investing in stocks or ETFs that could weather through a tough economic situation. Because trust me, we got a pretty strong headwind ahead of us, and it won't be a smooth ride even with quality stocks. And what better way to do it than with Interactive Brokers, where it is the best broker from all aspects that allow you to quickly open an account and start investing at the very cheap cost with no minimum funding requirement. Plus, you can trade fractional shares as well. I will leave the link down below for you to explore it. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.